All right. Hello.
Hi,
My
how are
name
you?
is. How are you, Michael?
Good, thank you.
Good. Well, let's introduce ourselves for everyone watching. I'm Jeffrey Uslip. I'm the chief curator at the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis, and I'm joined here with Michael.
Michael
That's your
Staniak.
cue.
Yeah, my name is Michael Staniak. I am an artist based in Melbourne, Australia, and I currently have a solo exhibition in Gallery 1 and the foyer of the Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis titled IMG.
Exactly. So we are here on the occasion of Michael's first museum solo show. Your solo first museum solo show anywhere or just America?
No, anywhere, anywhere.
That's amazing. So we are going to bring you into Michael's studio, speaking about his work, speaking about the works on view, and really introducing you to the way in which Michael's been working for the last several years. So Michael, I was very interested in your work because for me, your work was addressing the agency of abstract painting now and how we could think through the abstract mark of the artist and also what abstract painting might mean in a post-internet culture. And I think that's a term that has been used and manipulated and misused, but essentially the way I like to think about that term post-internet is the kind of the cultural implications of images and information decades after the advent of the internet. How has the internet changed the way we look at art, culture, and moreover, how we understand our own interconnectivity? For example, your abstract paintings operate differently than Jackson Pollock's did. And how has digital technologies and analog technologies made that possible? So I thought we would start kind of at the beginning. How did we get to abstract painting in your work? You started as a figurative artist, and actually, like most or many abstract painters, they began their work in a figurative tradition. Can you speak about the switch from figurative to abstract?
Yeah, well, I think just when I was painting in university at the Victorian College of the Arts, I think being surrounded by a lot of figurative and realist painting in Australia, which is it's quite popular here. It definitely influenced me early on with the way I was painting and with my subject matter. But I just found that trying to paint something that was about a subject like digital media or the internet, something that's really hard to visualize with a simple object or a figure, was starting to become problematic, and I was beginning to get a little bit confused about like how to represent digital technology in figurative painting. And so I think the first stage for me was to abandon figuration and representation and begin exploring options where process influenced the painting more so than the figure or a narrative or a subject per se. I mean, the aesthetic quality was really important to me. I'm not like a purely process-based painter now where the process is the outcome and that is it. But I
What
felt
led
like,
you to thinking through the internet? What led you to thinking through technologies in general for painting?
well, I think take for instance now, like the way we're interacting. Um, it's probably for me as an Australian artist, I'm so far away from a lot of what's happening overseas, and most of the information that I was receiving from exhibitions that I found influential or galleries or things like that, even artists that were coming out from the US or Europe. It was all via the internet, so via the screen. So most of my interaction, just like my interaction now, is through the screen. Most of my interaction with work was via the screen, and a lot of the work that was made in Australia was not quite didn't quite interest me in the same way as what was happening overseas. So I think that's where the first part of my interest in in the screen, and the relation to painting and how paintings are viewed on the screen and how they can be read differently in reality and on the screen interested me. I also had a background in digital media communications that I studied at Middle Tennessee State University, and so it was basically a theory-based course. And the interesting thing is, it was back in 2002, 2003, that time. So obviously, what I was learning then, Facebook hadn't even been invented, so a lot of things have changed. But it definitely piqued my curiosity about the way we could share images in a network and the way art would be read, and in particular, painting. I think that's probably the first thing that influenced me.
I mean, you bring up a lot of points that I think are going to really be carried through the conversation. And one is connectivity and isolation, or the need, how these digital technologies allow people to connect, but at the same time, they lead to a lack of one-to-one. They lead to a lack of in-person. And there's a lot of sense of dislocation in the work as well. Looking at something that's unfamiliar, being in a space that's unfamiliar. And I think the other thing you brought up that relates to the work is how we can understand the frame of the painting and the space of the painting as a screen or as a extension of the screen. And by that, I mean the computer screen to the rectangular geometry of the shape of a painting. What is the correlation between the laptop screen or the computer screen or a technological screen and the framing that we have come to understand painting to be? So I thought maybe we could start with kind of to be a little bit counterintuitive and to start with the body of work that viewers would see first when they come into the museum, and that would be the PNG series. Because I think if we start with the PNG and then slowly unpack how we got there, we might be able to really be able to think through all of the different undercurrents in your work. So would you just describe what PNG means and what viewers would see when they encounter a PNG painting?
Okay, so PNG, just like most of my works, like IMG, PNG, BMP, they're all file types or extensions of file names. So in this particular case, I chose PNG because it differentiated the work from previous series that I did. It wasn't necessarily important for me to make something that's very specific to a PNG file or a TIFF file or something like that, but I just wanted that separation between different series because I introduced a new element into my work at that stage when I was working on those paintings. Now, I'll just bring up an example of those paintings now. So you should be able to see on the screen. Let me know if it's working or not.
It's working. It's working.
Yeah. So you should be able to see. This is an example of one of my earliest PNG paintings. Not one of the ones that are on show, but one of the earlier examples. And with these works, like my IMG series, where I was interested in the dual reading of a painting on the screen, they look really quite textured, and you don't know how things are photographed and documented and post-produced. I mean, the shadows on these paintings could have happened with lighting, which in reality, when you see them, they look quite flat. And you realize that the texture that's formed on these paintings is formed by the paint itself and the medium. So the eye starts playing tricks, and like you said, seeing the work one-on-one, you get an uncomfortable feeling where you're uncertain where what you're seeing is what it is. It's usually we don't trust things on the screen or on the internet because we understand that it's easy to manipulate all sorts of digital files, but it's very easy to manipulate images on digital devices. I mean, these days Photoshop's pretty ubiquitous, and most iPads and iPhones have some kind of digital image processing software that is really easy to use. So obviously, trust in the image is something that's lacking sometimes when you see things online or on a computer. So, but in this case, when you see these in person, you actually think you know that it's going to be a textured work, especially if you've already seen it online, and then you see it in person and you don't get that same experience. You actually start doubting yourself, and I find a lot of people, like a lot of the audience, wants to touch the painting to confirm that what they're seeing is really what they're seeing.
I find that as well, even at the museum. People want to touch the paintings. So why don't you, I guess, start with what are we looking at? The background you said was a casting compound, correct?
Yeah, it's a casting compound. If I bring up this image, you can see closer.
Exactly.
There's a casting compound, which is has very similar processes in the ING paintings. It's a mixture of casting plasters and glues, and once it's poured on to a board, I manipulate the surface to create a texture that's reminiscent of like a Photoshop filter or effect or something like that. It was something that I worked on when I was exploring the IMG paintings, which were before this. So this is just a texture that's carried on through to this series. And it's at certain stages that I have to figure out the right time to achieve the right texture. If I wait too long or I don't wait long enough, I don't achieve the results that I actually want. And I use different types of plastics to achieve these textures. I didn't want to just make a texture kind of out of whatever I found. I actually considered what was a material that was inherently physical from objects that come from the internet. And I found that every single thing I purchase online is wrapped up in kind of like a plastic membrane. And I figured that this is actually a really useful material to make my texture with. So it's like this membrane that comes from this world that's online. It gets delivered to me and I unwrap it and I use that plastic to make my texture. And with these paintings, once I had the texture harden and I primed it so that I sealed it, I actually got a code digitally UV printed onto the textured surface. So the code on these paintings is actually taken from the image of another one of my paintings. So it could have been binary code, it could have been ASCII, like it's code that translates an image into an image on a computer, let's say.
Exactly. So let's go back to the faraway shot.
Yep.
For a second. So what I was most interested in these paintings was, well, first of all, you can't tell, as you said, you can't tell if they're two-dimensional or three-dimensional. So immediately they confuse the viewer's perception. Am I seeing a flat painting, or perhaps is this operating in a sculptural space? And that really does think about the truth value of these paintings. Can I trust what I'm seeing? And as you mentioned, the inkjet printed code on the surface of the painting corresponds to another one of your paintings online. So it's the digital code of another painting, which may be a color, right? So the digital code on this gray painting might correspond to a blue painting. And what I thought was interesting was that for the human viewer, these paintings, these PNG paintings, are imageless. There's no image, but it's only the computer that can decode and see perhaps the color of what this painting would be. And for me, the way in which you complicated the legibility of not only the truth value of an image, but really kind of altering the viewer's perception of depth and content. And in a way, what does it mean when you have an imageless abstract painting in 2015? I mean, for me, not only the role of truth, but the role of visibility is completely embedded in these works. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the title PNG comes from a file where you can compress a lot of information, and then when you uncompress it or decompress it, you have the pure file, like there's no corruption. So you can take a vast amount of information, compress it, and then when you open it back up, you didn't lose any information. So again, it talks about truth, it talks about content, it talks about, as we started this conversation, the possibility and the agency of abstraction.
That's right, and it's interesting that you mentioned that it's a file that you can shrink and expand without corruption. And these works in particular, the code is actually corrupted, because I did print an element of the code that was true to the original, but I also manipulated, like cut and copied and pasted many sections of code over one another to create a visual effect as well, because after all, painting for me is quite a visual thing, and I'm also interested in the aesthetics of the painting. So the code, if you would try to re-transcribe it or translate it back into an image, would probably be corrupt. And I find that an interesting extension of what you were talking about.
That is very interesting. So even in this impulse to create truth or to represent a truthful subject, you kind of undermine that. So, and if not undermine, perhaps you allow it to still be, I guess, aesthetic in a way, you know? That was it a conscious effort to not make the data on top of the painting true? And was that purely based in aesthetics?
It was, at first I thought I could make the code true, until I realized two things. One, that some of the codes were so long that you couldn't fit it on the painting anyway.
I see.
And two, for some reason, Photoshop, it kind of glitched when I put too much text on it once. So I had to start copying and pasting sections of code to fill the whole painting, which I really wanted to do. So it's strange that the actual medium that I was using or process that I was using to first create these paintings, which was Photoshop, which was computer-based, was actually setting certain parameters for me, which I had to overcome by problem solving and using another method than what I originally wanted, which is also like part of the painting process. And it probably was quite similar to the way I first created paintings for the PSD series, which we might touch on later.
Those. Do you want to show us those now? Because those are very interesting.
So here's an early one, actually.
So these paintings are extremely interesting to me because it looks like the gesture was made from a computer for for example, like a Photoshop tool. But in fact, that's all hand painted. So what was interesting to me was how you were complicating the legibility of the artist's hand. Was this made by a machine? Was it made by a human? You know, how do we understand images? Even the shadows are painted. So you were creating this illusionary space that looked technological or made by technological means, but in fact was a celebration of the artist's hand. So in a way, you're still undermining these technological processes by creating something that was purely from an artist. Do you think
and
from an artist's hand?
You're completely on the right track there, and I actually don't find these too much different than my IMG series or even the PNG, if you would forget about the printed element, because the IMG series, part of that confusion with the texture, whether it's flat or not, most people think that they're digitally printed when they first see them until they read the room sheet. at an exhibition, they can see that there's no digital printing involved. There's also an element where the artist's hand is not present, even though it's completely handmade. But with these ones, they are first drawn on Photoshop, so I can visualize what I want to achieve in the painting on Photoshop, and then once I have the composition correct on the computer, I then step by step recreate the process, just like you have to create layers in Photoshop to achieve the certain levels of the image or effects that you want. In a similar way, I recreated step by step the same processes in Paint, and so we have a marbled background that kind of looks like a liquefy effect. It could have been some kind of black and white photograph that's been liquefied in Photoshop, and that marble trope is also something that appears in kind of net art aesthetic, so it seemed fitting to have that kind of background for these lines to float on. And the lines, you know, I masked out the painting, I cut out the lines, and layer by layer sprayed acrylic paint, first a white layer and then soft layers of color to get that gradient going through it. And then once that was dry, I meticulously cut out the shadow layer. So the shadow layer did actually come on second, just like you would do in a Photoshop drawing.
So I have two questions to you. The marbleized pattern in the background, was that represented in the first Photoshop digital maquette?
It was when the very first ones that I trialed. I did use kind of like a liquefy pattern to see what that kind of marbled effect would look like. But subsequently in other paintings, I just randomly made these marbled effects to emulate that liquefy, because I knew that I could do it. I knew that it would have the result that I wanted.
And the other thing that I thought was very interesting is when you talk about replicating these layers, it's almost as if it's referring back to an old master technique of underpainting. Let's go back to the image. So you see, can we go to number, yeah, exactly. So what's interesting to me is when you talk about replicating these effects, it's almost like the underpainting of old master painting. You know, you replicating the layers of Photoshop from the Photoshop maquette are analogous to a larger tradition of painting, especially figurative painting, right?
It's not much different. It's not much different. And my core in painting, on the building blocks of my painting education, was kind of in that traditional figurative painting. I started off painting in, you know, using oils and learn how to underpaint and build up those layers and then use glazes. So it really is not far from the traditional way that oil paintings are, or had been, or still are created. But I even feel that it's quite similar when you use Photoshop and you make something from scratch, or if you draw over photographs and you have those same layers and you build them up, and then you can paint over and hide things and erase things. I mean, the traditions of building an image are sort of inherent for centuries, like into these new digital technologies. So I think it just it was like a natural progression to paint this way when I imitated these digital technologies.
And can you go to image number 19?
Yeah.
So for me, one thing that makes these paintings feel very current, but also in the best way possible retro, is the use of color. And for me, it felt like it was hearkening back to kind of a 1980s Miami Vice feel. That what's interesting is that we can associate these colors with another time, like the 80s, but also think about how our current digital technologies not only make this painting possible, but make this painting relevant. Does that make sense to you?
It does, and I think the '80s thing, it does come from the fact that there are these fluorescent pinks that turn into like a pale blue, and it does remind the viewer that of another time like the '80s, and maybe that's because I was born in the '80s, and somewhere deep inside me I have a real love for the '80s. Like I do like '80s music, and a lot of the sort of aesthetics have stuck with me. But in essence, I wasn't thinking about the '80s when I made these. I was thinking about Photoshop now and the colors. I mean, they say, you know, you have millions of color choices and they're kind of endless, but they're very restricted as well. And they look very Photoshop-esque, if there is a word like that. So it is interesting that although the technology is new, this aesthetic from our past is, which kind of was a time during that digital revolution, has sort of stayed with the technology all the way through until now. And even as recently as today, I watched a program on MTV, and their graphics, although they're made right now, and on the latest software, they do feel very much like they're coming from the past. So there is something about the technology, or the way we use it, or the visuals we enjoy, that keeps us rooted in some kind of other time.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're right. I mean, it really makes me almost time travel these paintings. And the other
Yeah.
thing that I think about conceptually, and I know it's something that we spoke about before, is that, you know, I've been thinking about the idea of the cyborg. I've been thinking about kind of the emotional resonance of machines. And when I see these paintings that look as though they were made by a machine, but were really made by the artist's hand, I can't help but think about that complication and thinking machines trying to feel. Do you see that coming through in this work at all, with the complete visual elimination of the artist's hand?
Um, I wasn't thinking about it too much. The only thing that probably prompted me to think about it a little bit was looking at Wade Guyton's work when I was sort of beginning to work in abstraction, and the way his printers like really oversaturated the canvas and tried to almost paint in their own way. And but he still helped them along, you know, they jam and he pulls the canvas through, and he still tries to have some kind of control, despite the main sort of characteristics of the painting being completely done by the printer. But so there is something where, even though machines maybe want to be completely autonomous, or there is that sort of, I guess, idea behind some of these, or you can maybe attribute an idea like that, I think the artist will always be present somewhere with the work, unless it's completely automated. Like now I've seen some new technology that they've invented at Google, where Google actually thinks of its own paintings, and like illustrates its own imagination, like based on all these images that are collected from all these image searches, and they actually look quite wild, and they look more like a surrealist trip on acid or something. So it's actually interesting that they're so different to what you would think a machine would make.
It's really very interesting. Why don't we go back to the holographic painting? So maybe take one step back from these and kind of show us how exactly, I mean, these were the first body of work that I became aware of in your work.
Yeah.
So now we're kind of going backwards from this idea of the PNG, the idea of the PSD, and now we're in you would call these the holographic paintings, or the IMG?
IMG, yeah, IMG. I only tab the word holographic or yellow, purple, pink, or whatever, like some kind of color signifier, just just so I can differentiate the paintings for myself and for other people when I share images. So really they're just IMG paintings, and they just have a unique number attributed to each one.
And these are made in a similar process. The ground is the casting compound, and then you spray gradients of acrylic paint over it. Is that correct?
That's right. So the same as the PNG works, it's a casting plasters and other glues, like a mixture, a concoction, so to speak, to make it like hard and plasticky. And then, yeah, just layers and layers of 20 or 30 or more layers of soft acrylic color, which I use with an industrial spray gun. And really, the two things that does is one, it allows me to create a nice even gradient, which has this very Photoshop aesthetic, and it's one of the most recognizable, you could say, digital tropes of like digital painting that you can see. I mean, you can see it in pretty much most digital work, and Corey Archangel exploited that to the full extent when he just displayed gradients, and the title of the work was exactly how you make that gradient, because it's pretty much like a 1 or 2 click process. But also the spray allowed me to give the works like a stippled look, which basically imitates an inkjet printer. So the reason a lot of people can get confused when they view these works in person, you can't quite see the detail on a photograph on a computer, but when you get up close, you can see tiny stipples. And I've been surrounded by printing for a long time, because my father, he's been involved in the printing industry, or was involved in the printing industry for almost 30 years. So I saw how a lot of the offset printing was done, and I saw the transition to digital printing through the company he worked for and other companies that they worked with, and I could see like the qualities of the print and how they could be observed up close with the different stipples and dots per inch and all that sort of stuff. So I understood that with this spray painting technique, I could achieve that kind of mimicking of this inkjet effect.
When I saw these for the first time, I felt like I was in the presence of a completely new embodiment of abstract painting, of representation. I felt as though not only did they look as if it was topographical, or perhaps even an aerial map of the moon, but because you had this very intense, bright, fluorescent, vivid colors, that it was almost like it was very amped up in the way that it felt like what I might describe as, abstraction on the moon, or alien abstraction. There was something so not human about these paintings that I was immediately sort of like, it's sort of like that Zen slap. I felt as though this is another end game, as if I was in the presence of another kind of end of painting conversation. Does that make sense? I felt like this was the end of painting in a way.
It does, and I think maybe because they are quite alien with the colors and I get a lot of people telling me that they think it looks like they look like alien landscapes in a way, or like you said, topographical shots. And I think, through my research, like when I did my master's or even before that, I was exposed to a lot of digital imagery that was quite unusual for the eye, and did seem pretty alien. Even things like when Google Earth first came out, and you could go to places where there wasn't much like city or the ocean or all that sort of stuff. It does have this weird topographical feel that does not seem familiar, especially when it's on your screen. So I can see how that reading happens. I mean, this work probably emulates that the best.
So, Michael, how did you get to the place where you wanted to make these paintings? Like, there seems to be a step that I'm trying to get to from figuration to here. I mean, this is a pretty
Yeah,
big creation. This is a pretty huge innovation.
yeah.
Why did you start using casting compound? Did you know you wanted to use these kind of fluorescent colors? It seems like either there was a large process of trial and error or a kind of moment of extreme innovation and enlightenment. I mean, it is such an unusual composition, such an unusual use of materials. It just feels like a major turning point.
Uh,
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this is an image that I would call unrecognizable in the way that we can't recognize what we're seeing. It just feels
right.
incredibly new. So where did this newness come from?
Well, I think if I look back at my figuration, and I actually wanted to find some examples of um, some of my old work, and I may have it on a hard drive somewhere, maybe back at my parents' place. I'm not really sure, but the computer where I actually had all of those on just completely broke. So once again, testament to digital technology not being the most formidable of archiving mediums. But anyway, so within my figuration, there was always an element of abstraction present, and I was always using colors that were quite unusual and unnatural for figurative painting, so to speak, or representational painting. Uh, they were all based on my interest in digital technology and digital printing, and I was using materials like printing inks and that were soluble with enamel or with oil-based paints. And I actually was more interested in the effects that these paints and then these inks had with the paint rather than the image itself. So I was actually beginning to get a little bit bored of painting an image, and I was much more interested in the effects that these colors had when they mixed with the enamel paints and stuff like that. So that was probably the first thing that really led to my exploration of abstraction. But it was a long process of experimentation and trial and error. Like there wasn't a specific aha moment where I figured one day I'm going to drop the brush and start making textured paintings. Like there was a long time where I was experimenting still with these printing inks and enamels on like perspex and painting on the back of perspex and trying to get this like screen like aesthetic. The problem was that as I was painting with enamel, it was actually making me feel sick, even though I was wearing like a respiratory mask and all that sort of stuff. I was still getting sick, so I had to stop using the enamel, and I had to try and figure out a way where I could use acrylic paint to achieve these effects that I wanted. And I think just it probably happened by accident because I can't exactly specifically remember when it happened, but I did start making these textured works because I figured that there's something about the reading, there's something that has to be inherently painterly, I felt, about these works, even though they're describing the digital. I didn't want them to be about pixels and about lines. I wanted them to be quite organic and feel quite painterly, and I felt the best way to do that is to have like a textured surface or some kind of impasto medium. And once I started working with these casting compounds and glues and spraying colors on them, I realized when I sprayed the color that some of the colors were picking up only on the edges of these ridges of texture and creating like a flattening effect, and that's how it happened. Like it was quite organic.
I mean, it's interesting that you speak about the enamel and you speak about the splatters because, for me, this really is a kind of, I don't want to say apocalyptic extension, but a kind of, I would guess, um, even a post-internet extension of Pollock. I mean, this use of the splatter, this use of it feels like, for me, it's really tied to that trajectory. And these that you're showing now feel as though, you know, we're looking at the moon again for the first time. You know, we're seeing a space outside of ourselves, that in some way, this is a space outside the possibility of what painting could be. And I guess this is where I talk about the agency of abstraction. You know, that there's a lot of not only meaning in materials, but you're presenting an image that we're so not used to seeing. It's taking us out of ourselves again. It's almost as though the cultural imaginary, you know, it sees the earth for the first time. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think that's testament to the power of abstraction. When it doesn't have this narrative, or you can't see things that you recognize, you attribute your own experiences onto these unfamiliar things to try and create a sense of familiarity. And I think that's why, I mean, I wasn't consciously thinking about moonscapes or terrains or anything like that. I mean, a lot of these earlier works, and these ones that I'm showing you are earlier works, were a lot just as much about experimenting with the medium and what I could do with it, as also creating these new images that could have been done with some kind of digital process or an unknown process that hadn't been invented yet or something like that. So they were creating these foreign images that kind of looked like terrains and alien landscapes, and I think a lot of people brought that kind of need to understand what they were looking at again. Like you said, like seeing the moon for the first time. I mean, it can be I didn't experience it in the way that people experienced it in the late 60s when the lunar landing happened, but you know, it was scary and foreign and like exciting at the same time. So I think people bring their own sort of experience to these works, and I find that I get more of these lunar readings from a certain generation, from like that lived through that period of space exploration as well, and less so from a younger generation like Y and Z or whatever. They see it more as they see the kind of flattening effect, like this Photoshop effect that I was talking about before. So it's interesting how people get their own reading.
People bring their own set of experiences to it. I want to make sure we also talk about a few other bodies of work. One would be the Internet Blues series.
Yeah.
Because for me, again, you're using that casting compound as the ground and then spraying this very seemingly uniform, but not at all, blue on top of it. And when I saw these paintings, I was thinking how the ripples might think about nature and water and rivers. And I was also taken to kind of Caspar David Friedrich and this idea of romanticism. But I was also taken to this place of the Facebook blue replacing Yves Klein blue. And in some way that this blank space that you have provided, this kind of blue screen, if you will, not only allows us to project these many different interpretations and readings onto it, but it allows us to be in a space of unknowing. And it also allows us to think through the space of a painting as a space where images can be projected and by extension uploaded. Mm-hmm. And that's where I come back to this idea of Facebook, that in a way, our interpretations, our thoughts, but also perhaps even images can be uploaded onto this ground that you've provided for us.
Yeah, well, these paintings have, my understanding of what you're saying is these paintings have potential. It's like a potential painting or a potential image that can be superimposed onto this one. So, and I think that pretty much is where I'm coming from with these works. As I was sharing paintings and images on Facebook and social media. Like the common theme when I looked at when I was using these sites is that they're always surrounded by this this blue these blue borders, this blue branding, and it seems to be the color of the internet as we use it,
Mhm.
as we commonly use it. So potentially every time you upload an image, it sits within that context of Facebook or Instagram or
But it's
even Twitter.
also a space for infinite possibility.
That's
And
right.
people can just stand in front of these paintings for hours. I mean, you're almost transfixed. And I think that's where the Caspar David Friedrich reference comes in, where the subject is just looking out, is often looking out on the landscape endlessly, you know. And that's the sense of possibility and wonder, but also the awe
But
of this romantic sublime.
yeah, and specifically the ones in the IMG exhibition at Council, they are they're quite large, and they do have this great relationship with the body of the viewer. So when you stand in front of them, you do feel like you're falling into this blue void or this blue pool. Even though I wasn't thinking about water and waves, it is quite liquid, and because I've used this texture, which I've kind of refined uh, when I was making these ones. Yeah, it does give it that ripple effect, like that Photoshop ripple effect, but it does have that liquidity that you're talking about, and this potential of falling into it, and like a romantic notion of this void that has an unlimited like scope, like you could enter it and anything could happen. But at the same time, I wanted the weight of these works to be overbearingly blue, because of the significance of them being pretty much every time you upload an image being owned by these social media sites. So as much as there's unlimited potential in sharing images and uploading and what you can do with them and manipulating them, they're also bound by this kind of corporate blue, which is signified as like a social media color or color of fluidity and communication.
Yeah, and on a kind of conceptual level as well, for me, they also speak about, you know, if we think about water as a signifier for the unconscious or the
Mm-hmm.
subconscious,
Mm-hmm.
that these blue paintings, the weight of these blue paintings somehow physically manifest or embody all of those, that kind of collective unconsciousness in a way. You know, the collective unconsciousness of this internet blue or this internet potential. They're actually quite, they feel quite, you know, deep when you see them. You know, there's a sense of a deep space that it's almost like that scene in Stargate, you know, where you've got that watery window or watery portal. It
Yeah.
has that quality to it, that it's that there's a pathway to something.
It strangely does, and so it's got a flattening quality because of the way they're made and because the texture and the paint is creates the shadow and it doesn't actually have a shadow in itself. But I think this relationship with this Eve Klein blue that people see when they see these works, these internet blue works, um, I think this depth and this liquidity happens because of this connection with this historical blue that's like quite weighted and was also like really dense. And when I've seen those Eve Klein blue works in person, they are really dense and they don't feel flat. It does feel like, you know, there's an endless space behind them. So uh, it it does. It talks about the history of that color and that kind of that sort of depth, and also like a liquidity of human communication. And and subconscious and information that's uploaded from the millions of minds onto the internet, and also, you know, it's got the elements of the corporate ownership of this information, which is like, you know, Facebook and those social media outlets that provide this kind of liquidity of information.
And before we speak about your newest work, I also wanted to touch on the last body of work that's in the exhibition, the data series, where
Yes.
you grind up and pulverize sort of antiquated hardware, such as CDs or DVDs or MDIS or silicon wafers, and you mix them in a resin and then apply it to the surface of the painting. So in effect, what you get is this kind of very glittery cosmology where the color is dependent on the material you were grinding up. So on view, we have a very large data painting made from ground up silicon wafers. So what we have is this very black and gray and shimmery and reflective surface where you can see these reflective particles in the painting. And what's amazing for me is that when I'm in front of the paintings, I feel as though I'm looking at the night sky. I feel as though I'm looking at a manifestation of the deep web or the internet. But it's also, again, back on the moon with these kinds of reflective pieces of metal. And people have been incredibly receptive and responsive to this work, I think because in person they are active and alive and transportative. And I've tried to also think through how these paintings are tied to the history and legacy of painting. So if paint is pigment and binder, you've replaced pigment with the ground silicon wafers, and the binder becomes resin. So in a way, this is just an extension of traditional painting, but only updated using the hardware and materials of our post-internet digital age. Is that a fair reading of this work?
Yeah, it is a very fair reading. And, you know, acrylic paint, in essence, is pigment in a resin binder. So really, it's not really too far away from acrylic paint or the way we make acrylic paint. I mean, in this instance, the granules or the shards or whatever you'd like to call them are a lot bigger than a powdery pigment, so it doesn't have such a smooth finish as paint. But in essence, that is a very similar process that I use to make these paintings. And in a way, I want these materials like, and you use the word antiquated, but you know, CDs are still very, very common and like readily available and used all the time. And silicon wafers are found in pretty much every device, every electronic device we use that requires some kind of microchips, because they're like it's a superconductor, and they engrave chips onto these wafers and dice them, as they call it, into like small chips which go into your phones or iPads or all sorts of devices. So it's quite current technology, but it's technology, you know, what is current technology? In 6 months, the new thing comes along, and this so-called current technology isn't, but it's still utilized in a way. But I'm kind of preserving these physical forms of digital media in a painting, or in the idea of a painting, of paintings, whether through reproduction, through just the ideas that they represented, or the paintings themselves last, you know, hundreds of years. Even cave paintings lasted tens of thousands of years. So I'm kind of archiving these media in in the traditions of painting, and sort of giving them a new lease of life, you could say.
Yeah, they
They
feel
are.
like there's a renewed possibility of the material. A new encounter is formed.
There is, and there's also a new possibility for painting as well. Like
Mhm.
that's part of my investigation of how digital media affects painting, whether it's through screen aesthetics or the way we use digital media to draw or paint, or whether it's just the materials themselves, like how they're changing, like how we're finding new things to paint with or to represent the traditions of painting. It's not just oil on canvas anymore, and I feel that's really important to me. And I get very attracted to new materials, even in some of my current studio. You could say experimentation and research. I'm constantly looking for new materials that at the same time come from this digital world, or maybe they are used to build devices, but they're also somehow just creating a fresh approach, if not for everyone to look at, but for me to make new paintings.
And Michael, I really want to speak about your new work, and you have a
Yeah.
new show that just opened at Steve Turner Gallery in Los Angeles. And it's a show that I find incredibly innovative, incredibly salient, and you've really, moved your practice in another direction. You've really built upon what was there, and now it's almost like the artist's hand is coming back through either cave painting or sand painting. And you have this image on the screen. Will you take us through what we're looking at and why
Yes.
we're looking at it?
Yeah. So as you said, the building blocks of my old paintings are still there, like the IMG paintings, that they're still casting compound, or with the casting compounds and glues. It's the same sort of compound that I've been making a while back. This time, instead of making a random texture with the plastics, I've actually created a texture using created markings and gestures using my fingers. And it's funny how we were talking about how the artist's hand isn't present in the works, in my previous works, but they're all handmade. Well, I was considering that very much through the couple of years that I was making those paintings, that I have always been quite involved in my paintings, and especially when I'm using a device like a laptop with a touchpad or an iPad or a touch screen like that. I'm constantly using my fingers and constantly finger painting, and this is pretty much like that sort of initial way, like an infant explores with materials and paint, is always with the fingers. It's very tactile. It's a very tactile exploration. I think the way we use devices now is digital devices are, you could say, are in their infancy, because we've been communicating for thousands of years, but digital media has only been around for a few decades, and let alone touch screens just a few years. So the way we use it is
Maybe it would be more fair to say the artist's hand as we know it, or the artist's hand as we're used to understanding it, because you're absolutely right. Your hand is in every single one of these works from every single one of these series. I think it's just not visually apparent in the way that we're used to recognizing it.
And I wanted it to become more visually apparent, so that's why I included it in these ones. And the way I make these gestures are quite similar to the way I would use a touchscreen. There's a lot of single and multiple finger swipes and turns and swirls, but I also make conscious decisions about the composition, but also about making these finger swipes and these gestures and characters look like some kind of ancient coded language, like it could have come from hieroglyphics or cuneiform from 5,000 years ago, and attribute them back to these paintings and create like almost a new secret language, which is interesting, because that's the idea kind of came from when I did the PNG paintings, and there was a code printed onto the painting, and it was a new language, like one that I couldn't understand, and maybe some programmers would be able to understand, but it's a very elite sort of language that only the privileged few can really figure out. And in a similar way, hieroglyphs and cuneiform was reserved for the privileged and like the clergy and things like that. So it's kind of looking at this history or this cycle of communication that we've come into. There's also an element of digital printing in this. That once I made these gestures in the compound and it's set, I then printed a stock image of stone onto the top of it. And this actually stock image of stone was slightly manipulated in Photoshop, just diced and collaged a little bit. It's very difficult to see. Just as a testament to the ease in which we can manipulate digital information, but not so much like the physical form of information, the physical output as we have done for thousands of years, from carving into stone to even painting on canvas. Once it's sort of there, it's there.
And of course, my mind goes straight back to Pollock again, because as you know, he was very influenced by Native American sand painting.
Yes.
So, you know, it's all there in your work, and this history and legacy of abstraction is there, but you've really created a renewed and new visual vocabulary for it. I love that you had printed this stock image of stone on top of it. You know, the juxtaposition from the unique and signature and individual markings of the artist's hand serves as the ground for this image, this stock readily available image, and that kind of conflation and juxtaposition and really collision of registers, I think, is what makes this work vibrate.
And that was definitely part of my reasoning about using these stock images. It's also something that's readily available to everyone, and in a similar way, the first cave paintings were done on these rock walls that were just there. They were there for people to sort of use, and so these individual markings were placed on these kind of arbitrary walls that were sort of for anyone to play around with. And it's a similar sort of thing with these stock images. You're quite right that it's like it's an anonymous image. It's readily available for anyone in the world to download, and it's this unique signature that I've put on it that inherently makes it my work, so to speak.
And do you have any images of the sculptures you were showing? Because those felt incredibly, not just innovative, but a really interesting departure in terms of the migration of these, yeah, as you can see, these kinds of forms that look technological, but also part artifact, part, there's a real sense of excavation and representation in the work. What was the point of departure for these? What are we looking at? What are the materials?
These first two, well, actually the first three, bronze, solid bronze casts, which are set in travertine, like a solid travertine block. So these first two images are actually patinated bronze. So there's a patina that's been applied to them to, in essence, give them a different sense of materiality, but also put them through different conditions and different chemical treatments, and kind of like weathering could potentially change the look of something that's very old. And the idea here was to basically preserve information. The original tablet that I made was made from clay, and the impressions that are on the surface were made by pressing the clay tablets into different parts of an internet server rack. So there was they're not just like random marks that I just made or found or something like that. There was like a reasoning behind these impressions, because it's most of my work or influence comes from that kind of digital media, and I wanted these works to undergo a traditional form of preservation and also a new form of preservation, which is capturing them in via a 3D scan and then printing them using SLS, which is selective laser sintering, which essentially just sinters powdered nylon layer by 10% of a millimeter, layer by layer, until you get like this object that comes
So
out of it.
some of them are bronze and some of them are nylon.
That's right. This is 3D printed nylon, and same with this one here. And so the idea was to preserve these objects, and these objects like are these real world signifiers for my paintings, you could say, because the paintings themselves look like kind of tablets, stone tablets as well. So it was all about that kind of information preservation, the way we're registering art objects digitally now, and even artifacts from 5,000 years ago. Everything's being scanned, everything's being documented and archived digitally, and there's so many technologies that have been refined and produced to kind of perfect that method. But a lot of trust is put into digital media, which is really quite a new thing, and the information, who knows what's going to happen to it in a few years, or how easily corruptible or how easy it is to manipulate it. That history could be rewritten very easily. So all this stuff interests me, and that's what I was thinking about when I was making these sculptures.
It might even be very interesting to see how this body of work, both these sculptures and the paintings that with the rocks, the screen print of the rocks overlaid, how they would function or be encountered in kind of like an ancient Near East wing of an encyclopedic museum. Like what would happen if the viewer would come upon this work among other artifacts, sculptures, paintings from other civilizations? It seems like these works time travel in a way.
They do. I mean,
they force us in the future. It's almost as if we are our future selves rediscovering or excavating the present.
And I actually do, yeah, that I probably think about a little bit when I make these, that these are like future relics for generations to come. And if we would put them alongside ancient relics now in some kind of museum, I do think that there would be some kind of like differentiation, purely because when you see these in person, there's like a falseness about the material, like the digital prints on the paintings and the casting compound. Like, even though it does imitate stone and it does look a bit like stone, there's something that's it really is digital about them. And,
well, I think that's even more interesting, actually, because all of our displays of ancient civilizations is a construction anyway. Unpainted marble sculptures, for example. Our recontextualization and revisualization of ancient cultures it's a construction. It's a fiction to some level. Obviously, there's a real drive towards history and authenticity and the preservation of knowledge, but in and of itself, it's inevitable that there's some part of it that's a construction and a fiction. And I think your work might really offset that nicely in that context.
Actually, yeah, you bring up a good point, because after all, a lot of these artifacts and documents or objects that did come from an interpretation, like it was some kind of human interpretation of a thing, an idea, or a surrounding. And you're right in a sense that there can be misleading facts or falsities, like when you that aren't that don't replicate reality in the same way that the artist may have seen it. So in a way, these works they kind of do a similar thing, like they're real and they replicate an object that I made, or like a piece of stone that's been documented, but they're also false because they're not those things. So I think it's a good point.
Well,
It's a little bit,
Michael,
yeah, sorry.
this might be a good place to kind of come to a close, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to either show or talk about another body of work, or if you feel like we've really kind of gone through your trajectory, we could stop here.
I'd be glad to give you a studio tour while we're
Yes.
here.
Give us a studio tour. Show us around.
Yeah, that's always fun. You know, that's one thing about being on a laptop and with all this digital communication we're talking about, that we can just move around quite easily. So right now, you can see the little bit of the library in the background, and I've actually got a wall of books in front of me that, you know, when I don't want to talk to people, I can just sit behind my books and sleep. But so yeah, here we're just in my main part of the studio where I just make most of my work. The funny thing is, so this whole factory, I established the studios about 6 years ago, and this whole factory is an offset printing factory. And this room right here, it used to be the plate making room for offset printing, where you expose the film onto the plates, and it became, you know, a redundant room once everything went digital. And so as did a lot of the rooms around here, so I started renovating the space with the permission of the owner, of course, building owner, to create studios, a studio complex, which I call Paradise Hills. And it started off as 6 studios, and then now throughout the years, I built more and more, and now there are actually 24 studios, and most of them are occupied. And during that time as well, here you can actually see a work from the body of work that I did at Anaruma Gallery earlier this year in Naples. That was titled Permanent Display, so quite relevant to what we were talking about.
Exactly, quite sharp.
This is just one of those that didn't make the cut, and I just had it hanging up here just for the purpose of display for when I walked around the studio, actually. But yeah, during the time while I was renovating the studios early on, I decided that I could also find a space for a gallery. So it's almost been 5 years now that I opened Paradise Hills, but this room in here was part of the gallery, which is now part of my studio. I use it. I had to expand a little bit, but I still run the gallery in a couple of other rooms. Here you can see some data paintings that were in the process. One that hasn't quite worked out, so it's just sitting there, and we'll probably go into the scrap heap. And there's also a canvas when I was working on the series for LA that just happened that, you know, there was a bit of a fault in the printing, like the process of printing and the digital media that I use isn't, you know, it's not perfect. It's quite interesting. The machines fail quite often, actually. So I sometimes get just rejected images that I haven't even manipulated yet. Here you can also see another work from the series for the Anaruma Gallery that I wasn't really happy with the composition.
And what is the image? Was that images of marble printed on top?
Yeah, so they're stock images of stone and marble and granite and things like that, which I've sliced up, you know, dissected and collaged into kind of like a primitive arrangement of shapes, but also it just speaks about the ease in which I can manipulate stone via a digital image. Here's another one.
Those are beautiful. They have the surface has a real presence. I mean, they look real.
Yeah, they do. I'll go back to it because it's, you can really like, I mean, there is a hardness to it because of the compound that I actually print onto, like it is quite stone-like, so it does give it that sense of realness.
And weight.
That it is stone, but when you do get up close, you start, the image starts breaking down, and you start getting blurs and splotches of ink and things like that. So it's interesting that the illusion sort of fails.
That is actually interesting. The idea that the illusion fails, or as we had a historian of American visual culture specializing in technology come and see the work, and one word he used was deceptive.
Yeah.
And that idea of deception, that the image might not be true or the technique might be unclear, I think is very much part of what we were talking about throughout the last hour, really. To think about, and I think it's part of the agency of painting. It's part of the truth value of this work that really is linked back to the truth value of how images and information is trafficked and migrated in a post-internet reality or a post-internet culture. That's why these paintings might feel as though they could be under the post-internet rubric, not so much the way it's been understood in the past, but really in the way of how images and information can be questioned, and how our encounter with images and information is shaped by the cultural imaginary in which we live and operate.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it is pretty much exactly what we touched on before. I'm actually
That's the first time I've heard you agree to post-internet and dialogue with your work. See, I got you to say, yes, I agree.
I agree with your analysis of it, definitely. Right now we're in the one of the rooms of the gallery, and actually we're between shows, so I thought I would hang up one of the data paintings that I just made.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Which
is that made from an M disc?
No, this is DVD.
DVD, because it's purple.
Yeah, DVD recordable. So I also do have aesthetic control over these paintings, because the canvas I can actually paint the canvas a certain color, and it does enhance the M discs, or it can darken them, or in this case, like, it gives them a little bit more of a bluer tint. But at least this way, if I move around the painting, you get that sense of action, you get that sense of activity that the medium has, and it's almost performative. Like, as a viewer, I want to move because I want to see it constantly flicker and change.
Yeah, that's how they're alive. And also this painting you're talking about on the canvas is another just form of underpainting. It's another painterly tool. That's amazing.
That's it. Now, as I move through the corridor, there's like some of our older exhibitions, the postcards and things like that. It's a new room of Paradise Hills.
Amazing.
This gives you a sense of, like, I call it Paradise Hills projects now, because the gallery is a bit smaller and we just have free shows for emerging artists that they can utilize these two rooms to kind of experiment and really sort of make crazy work if they want. And that's always been the idea of Paradise Hills. You can see I just laid a new lawn in the hallway.
Paradise Hills is the new Shady Acres.
I haven't heard of Shady Acres, but
American joke. Amazing.
So yeah, that's it. Like, these are the corridors of the studios, and
it's incredible. The space is vast.
Yeah. Oh yeah, it's a huge factory. All you see on the side here are like old offset printing job bags, like back when you had to keep the film so that you could re-expose the plate. So they just never really got rid of this stuff, and it's just here amongst like the studios. You see one of my spraying areas, and down there you can see a an old school lift shaft.
Scary.
Unfortunately, I'm on the first floor, and sometimes when I make heavy stuff, I have to use that thing. But it does actually, I can lift up half a ton, so it's pretty good. It's been around for years, but it still works.
Sounds great. Your space is beautiful there.
Yeah, look, it's like, speaking of time machines, like maybe this is why I feel like I make work that does have this sense of trajectory, transcending time and going on these different historical trajectories. This building, when you walk into it, I could show you, but it'll probably take too long. In the offices upstairs for the printing factory, they're still quite Art Deco. So you as you move through different corridors, it's like you're stepping into different periods. So this building's over 100 years old, and the offices haven't changed much. So there is a strong connection between this studio and the history of this area.
Amazing. Well, Michael, thank you for showing us the studio, and thank you for speaking to us about your work. It was really very exciting. Yeah, I mean, your show is up for a few more days in St. Louis. It's been really incredible to have your work here. And yeah, I just wanted to say thank you so much.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank you guys too for obviously making the show possible, but also making this conversation, this interview possible, because I like being able to share, my thoughts and behind the works, and so hopefully people will get something from this.
Absolutely. And, I think this kind of a record it's always very important to hear the artist speak about their work, to have that first person account and narrative outside of art historical or curatorial interpretation.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, Michael, we will see you soon, and more to come.
Yes, absolutely. A few more shows on the way. So thank you very much, and yeah, see you all soon. See you all next time.
Bye.
Bye-bye.